we are learning the laws of the mitzvot, commandments in the land of Israel. And one of the special ones is the mitzvah of Hafrashat Challah, which, as you'll see now, if I'm explaining about it, it's mainly in the land of Israel, and we also do it also in the diaspora out of Israel. So that's it. We thought of sharing the topics we're learning with the community, and we're happy it's happening. Ephraim, I'll mute myself so you can have no problems, and we can begin in just one moment. Just one person is joining us, so just one moment. Okay, and friends, so I'm muting myself. I'll turn the video off, and I'll continue. If people join, I will bring them in. And good evening, Tanya. We're just beginning now.
Hi, thank you. How are you?
How are you? Good evening. Good to see you.
Okay.
At the end, I asked my wife to give two tips of two ways of braiding challah. That will happen at the end. I'm thanking her for joining in the last moment because someone who was supposed to be here, he left, couldn't do it. We'll begin. I mean, you can record it also, so you can afterwards use it.
Okay, so thank you, Rabbi Wendy, for the introduction. So today's shiur is going to be covering the topic of the difference between the land of Israel, Eretz Yisrael, and Chutz La'aretz, vis-a-vis regarding Hilchot Challah. The difference between the application of Hilchot Challah in Israel and in outside of Israel. And we just thought this nice medieval picture of Israel as the center of the world. So let's. I just want to talk about the layout of the shiur. So in the first part of the shiur, we're going to speak about more a theoretical issue, categorizing challah, defining, in theoretical terms, what challah is. Then the second half, we're going to speak about the scope of the mitzvah in Israel and Chutz La'aretz, which will lead us and give us the tools for understanding the halacha l'maaseh in the third part. Okay, so let's start with the first part. So the pasuk says in the Torah, Sefer Bamidbar, Daber el bnei Yisrael v'imarta aleihem bevoachem el haaretz asher ani mevi etchem shama. All right, so speak to the Jewish people and say to them, when you come to the land, when you enter the land, which I am taking you to, v'haya ba'achlechem milechem haaretz tarimu truma laHashem. And then when you eat from the bread of the land, you shall set aside a gift for Hashem. So I want to point out two aspects, just the different bolded aspects that we see here in the pasuk. So we see bivoachem el haaretz in the first pasuk, when you come into the land. Okay, and then we see that it says v'achlechem milechem haaretz, when you eat from the bread of the land, and then challah is called tarimu truma, that you should set aside a gift. So there are 2 points here about challah. One is that it has a certain relationship to the land of Israel, and then 2, it has a certain relationship to truma. So truma is the first tithe that is taken off of the fruits of Eretz Yisrael and given to the Kohen. So there are 2 issues. So we have challah as a type of truma, and we have challah as a mitzvah hatliya ba'aretz. So I think before I started learning this, especially, I thought challah was definitely a type of truma. If the pasuk says tarimu truma laHashem, then it's probably just a type of truma. Or if it says bivoachem el haaretz, when you come to the land, then that probably means that challah is a type of mitzvah that's tliya ba'aretz. So let's deal with each issue on its own. So first, challah as a type of truma. So you have the classic. I set out the classic position. Maybe challah is a type of truma, but the Rambam has a interesting position. I just want to also deepen, the similarities between challah and truma. Right? Both by challah and truma, according to Torah law, even if you take off the smallest piece, then you've already you fulfilled your obligation. Only midrabanan is there a certain amount that you have to take. So challah and truma are similar in that regard. And this would also fit into something which Rav Aaron Lichtenstein set out, that truma, the idea of truma is not to sustain the kohanim, right? Maaser, that's given, it's a significant amount. That's something that can sustain people. Whereas truma, that's something it's an insignificant amount, right? If you can take, even a small portion and fulfill your obligation, that's not going to support a Kohen and his family. So really the idea of truma is to show, okay, I recognize God's involvement in the agricultural process, in providing food. So therefore it can be a symbolic gesture. It doesn't have to be a significant amount. And then perhaps challah is the same way. Challah it's called truma. So the idea is, before I make bread, before I make sustaining food, I recognize God's role in that food. However, the Rambam seems to have a different approach. The Rambam, in his descriptions of challah in the Sefer HaMitzvot, focuses more on the aspect of giving it to the Kohen. And just for the sake of contrast, I'll read from the Sefer HaMitzvot. The Rambam says, Shetzivanu lahafrish challah me'arisotenu v'litzna kohen. God commanded us to separate the challah and give it to the Kohen. Now, if we read the mitzvah of truma in the Sefer HaMitzvot, the Rambam says, Hi shetzivanu lahotzi truma. Hi shetzivanu lahotzi truma gdola. So conspicuously missing from the Rambam's description of truma is the fact that it needs to be given to the Kohen. Okay, we find this again when the Rambam's describing the mitzvah of challah. He's describing challah as a mitzvah to be given to the Kohen, and truma as an idea of you have to kind of fix your food. You have to make sure you take out any obligations you have before you eat it.
You would think it would be the opposite, if anything.
Somebody's asking a question, yeah?
You would think it would be the opposite, if anything, that truma is what's important, and challah is just challah. It can be theoretical.
So, I mean, based off an understanding of truma as something symbolic, then it makes sense that there's no focus on giving it to the Kohen. Right? It's all about taking out the symbolic amount. And as well, in the way the Rambam, as a organizer, where does he put Hilchot Challah in the Mishnah Torah? He doesn't put Hilchot Challah by Hilchot Trumot, right? Even though Challah is called Truma in the Torah, he puts Challah in a group of halachot of matznot kahuna, the gifts that are given to the Kohanim, like bikurim, or the parts of the animals that we have to give to the Kohanim. So the Rambam shows through his organization, through his description of Challah, that challah is not necessarily, it's not truma, it's something else.
No, so you have to do, so when you have a piece of bread, you have to take truma and you have to take challah?
No.
Okay.
Okay, so we see that challah and truma are potentially different things. Now let's get to challah as a mitzvah hatluya ba'aretz. Okay, so the Mishnah in Kiddushin says, Kol mitzvah shehi tluya ba'aretz einu noheget ela ba'aretz. Any mitzvah that's dependent on the land is only applies in the land of Israel. V'she'ena tluya ba'aretz, anything which is not dependent on the land, noheget bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. It's practiced both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Israel. So then the Gemara asks over there, right off the bat, Amar Rav Yehuda, hachi ka'amar. Right, this is what the Gemara means to say. Kol mitzvah shehi chovat haguf, noheget bein ba'aretz bein b'chutz la'aretz. Right, he says, when the Mishnah says that what does it mean that's tluya ba'aretz or it's not tluya ba'aretz? So Rav Yehuda is saying that a mitzvah, which is an obligation on the body, that's going to be both in Eretz Yisrael and in chutz la'aretz. But if it's an obligation on land, on the ground, then it's not. Then it is only in Eretz Yisrael. So Rashi, commenting on this Gemara, says, "What's an example of chovat karka? What's an example of an obligation that's on the land?" He lists challah. Okay, so Rashi seems to be right. He fits our classical understanding of challah. It's a mitzvah tluya ba'aretz. But what's interesting is the Rambam, again, he takes a different approach. The Rambam says, the way he describes, in Hilchot Trumot, when the Rambam describes the the idea of mitzvah tatiyot va'aretz, he only really speaks about truma. But then in Hilchot Bikurim, when he discusses challah, he brings a drasha. He brings a derivation from the Torah to prove that challah is obligatory in the land of Israel. So what the Rambam seems to be saying is that challah is not a mitzvah tiyah ba'aretz. The Torah comes and says that no, but you should only really practice it in the land of Israel. And Tosfot point this out, and they say, why is challah different? Right? Challah is not a classic. Tosfot hold that challah is a mitzvah tiyah ba'aretz, but they say it's not a classic mitzvah tiyah ba'aretz, because challah, the obligation for challah only starts once you mix the water in with the flour and you start making the dough.
Well, is that just for Shabbos?
That's for what you're saying for what? For challah?
I mean, challah. Yeah, I thought challah only applied, for Shabbos, or does it not? Maybe I'm
no.
confused.
Challah can apply to any baked goods, anything that's baked during the week, or it could be anything for during the week. It could even include, according to some opinions, cakes and cookies.
Oh, okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you for your question, Brett.
That's it. That like that. Go ahead. I may have some.
Okay, so but how does the Rambam understand the pasuk? Right, the pasuk that we read at the very beginning, right, which said "Bevoachem el haaretz vayabach lechem bilechem haaretz." That seems to be explicit that challah is a mitzvah which is dependent on the land. How could the Rambam think that challah isn't a mitzvah that's dependent on the land?
Good question.
So, what I saw, Rav Michael Rosenzweig of Yeshiva University, what he wrote was that according to the Rambam, challah isn't dependent on the holiness that's inherent in the land of Israel. It's dependent on any area which is called by the name the land of Israel. Okay, and this will be expanded on later. Essentially, it's two different ideas. There's a distinct idea of the holiness of the land of Israel, which is what teruma is dependent on. And then you also have the obligation for the land of Israel, which is what challah is dependent on. And I'll explain, because according to the Rambam, there are certain areas which were conquered by the Jews who came from Mitzrayim, but weren't conquered by the people who came from Bavel in the beginning of the Second Temple period. So those lands which were conquered first, during the First Temple era, but not during the Second Temple era, the Rambam says that there's an obligation min haTorah to separate challah there. How could that be? There's no kedusha there nowadays, so it must be that challah is dependent on the fact that this land is associated or is known as the land of Eretz Yisrael. It's true that the land is no longer holy per se, but since it's related to the land of Israel, you would still take challah there. So essentially, we've had two models of challah. Okay, so now, as we covered the first topic, categorizing challah, and we proposed this very interesting suggestion of the Rambam that challah is not really like truma, okay, and it's also not necessarily a mitzvah tiyah ba'aretz. If you're not satisfied with what the Rambam says, you can still go with the classic understanding. Challah is another type of truma. That's just another type of a mitzvah tiyah ba'aretz. So now we'll discuss the issue of the scope of challah in the land of Israel and outside of Israel.
Yeah, because this rabbi wasn't present, like what's he talking about? I mean, in a general area, does that include?
I'll explain about that after.
I was thinking you would get there, but.
Okay, so now we're going to speak about the scope of the mitzvah of challah in Eretz Yisrael and in Chutz La'aretz. So ground zero is a Mishnah in Challah, in the fourth parak of Challah. And Masechet Challah, it's actually a short Masechet. It's only 4 chapters long. So the Mishnah says like this: Rabbi Gamliel Omer. Rabbi Gamliel says, Shalosh aratzot lachallah. There are like 3 distinct lands when it comes to challah. Eretz Yisrael ve'ad Kaziv, from Eretz Yisrael until Kaziv, which is like the northernmost reach of Israel. Challah achat. if you have your challah, you have you have 5 pounds of flour, and you mix it all up. Okay, so you take 1 piece of challah off. That's the first area, Eretz Yisrael. Okay, very simple. Mikaziv ad hanahar v'ad amana shtei chalot. Right. So in the second area, which is the area which was conquered by the people who came from Egypt, but wasn't conquered by the people who came from Babylonia, he says you take 2 chalot. Okay.
Mhm.
Min hanar v'ad amana v'lifnim, and then from the area which, the furthest area. Okay, he says shtei chalot. There also you take 2 chalot. Utavul yom ochla. So what's different about this third region is that it's even more lenient about who can eat it. A kohen who's a tvul yom is somebody who had been tameh. He went to the mikvah and he's still waiting for the night to come for his purification process to be complete. But in this area, with this third region of challah, even somebody who hasn't become completely tahor yet can still partake of the challah. And Rabbi Yossi even has a more lenient opinion. He says, "Eino tzarich tvila." You don't even need to have went to the mikvah in order to eat the second challah in this third region. So I'm just going to summarize. I have a chart here that will summarize the different opinions or the different options potentially. Okay, so we have Eretz Yisrael. How many chalot? You take 1. Okay, how much is the first challah that you take out? So I wrote here that says shiur. What is shiur? What is the amount that you need to take out? So again, min haTorah, according to Torah law, you only need to take out, a symbolic amount from the challah. Midrabanan, someone who's a householder takes out 1/24th of the dough, and someone who's a baker takes out 1/48th. Okay. Obviously, there isn't a second dough in Eretz Yisrael. And then in the second region of Kaziva Amana, how many chalot do you take out? You take 2. How much is the first? How big is the first challah? So it's kishiur. Okay, but it's also burnt. Okay, why is this challah burnt? So essentially, this land of Kaziv until Amana, it was decreed at some point in the Second Temple period that the lands of the non-Jews all have the status of tamei meit. Right? Anybody who goes there, it's as if he became tamei meit. Presumably because at that time, the non-Jews didn't mark their graves, so there could have been different, could have been bones in different areas. People become tamei. So therefore, it was impossible for a kohen or for the dough that was made into challah there to be tahor. A kohen can only eat the challah if he is tahor and if the challah itself is tahor. So because we can only, since it's tameh, we can't give it to the kohen, so we burn it. But we take out kishiur, we take out 1/24th or 1/48th, because as we said, let's say according to the Rambam, this area is still obligated min haTorah in challah. So we're going to take out the amount that's required. And then the second,
when did they get that 1/24? I mean, what's the source for that? Is it arbitrary or what? Or what's the source for that amount?
What's the source for the 1/24th,
just
1/48th?
Yeah. I mean, and then, yeah. I mean, I'm just curious.
I don't remember what the source is for the 1/24th. Let's say the 1/48th. The reason why we say the baker, why does he get to give less? So since he's giving on such a big scale, since he's baking so much, if we'd require of him to, take 1/24th, he would be giving too much. He'd go out of business. So we say he's allowed to give less. Also, since he's going on such a big scale, even if he takes only 1/48th of the challah, then it's still enough for the kohen.
Okay, good. Okay.
So this second challah, which is given to the kohen, has no shiur. Right? The idea outside of Israel, we want to remember, this is a key idea in Hilchot Challah, right? We have Challah outside of Israel, Kedei shelo tishtakach Torat Challah miYisrael, right? So we do not forget the mitzvah of Challah. The Jewish people should not forget the mitzvah of Challah. So this second Challah is symbolically reenacting the idea of giving Challah to Kohanim in Eretz Yisrael, but it's purely symbolic.
Mhm.
So we've gone to the first three areas, and then Amanah to outside, further out from there, you take 2 chalot. Now in this third region, everything is completely derabanan. So the first challah is burned because really it's just symbolic. So there's no shiur. You can take a symbolic amount and burn that symbolic amount. The second challah, again, we want to reenact giving to the Kohen. So you take out, 1/24th or 1/48th, and you give it to the Kohen. Now there's some disagreement between the Rishonim. What is included in this third region? So according to the Rambam, he says that this third region includes all of Chutz La'aretz. So essentially, according to the Rambam, even in America, you should be taking 2 chalot when you do Hafrashat Challah. The first challah you burn, okay, and then the second challah you give to a Kohen who, either a Kohen he could be Tamei Meitz, it could be Tamei Sheretz, it could be Tuma which has been externally imposed on the Kohen, or it could be Tuma which originates from internally, right, from the Kohen himself, all different tumot that arise from emissions. However, the Rush, he says that this amanah to outside only applies to Bavel and areas that are far from Israel. And he says there's a fourth region, which is a little stricter. But the Rambam is a little simpler to understand, where he says the third region is basically all areas of Chutz La'aretz that are not the areas that were conquered by the people who came from Egypt. Okay, so the question is this: why is it that in Chutz La'aretz nowadays, if you took a survey of people who took challah in their lives, they would say, and you ask them, how many challahs, did you separate? Everybody's going to say 1. Everybody's going to say 1. Why is that, right? Especially according to the Rambam. The Rambam says, according to the Rambam, you should really only be taking 2. Why is it that everybody just takes 1?
Who are we going to give it to?
Okay, that's one potential answer. Good. We had a suggestion here. You have nobody to give it to, but he's going to give it away, so I have to stop him. Okay, so now we're going to be looking at the evolution of a halacha, right? Why is it only 1 challah in Chutz La'aretz? Okay, so there are really 3 steps here, and it will eventually lead to the minhag in Chutz La'aretz to only take 1. Okay. So how do we even get to the fact that challah is only midrabanan now, right? So we know, or we said in that challah is only midoraita, it's only on a Torah level in Eretz Yisrael. According to the Rambam, it's not just that challah is only on a Torah level in Eretz Yisrael, it's only on a Torah level if most of the Jewish people are in Israel. Okay? So now, soon, perhaps there will be a majority of the Jewish people in Israel. But for the last 1900 years, there haven't been a majority of Jewish people in the land of Israel. So therefore, in Eretz Yisrael and in the Chutz La'aretz, challah was midrabanan. So the rabbis legislated, and it's ascribed to Ezra HaSofer at the beginning of the Second Temple period, that the practice of challah would continue, but just on a rabbinic level. Okay, so everything's on a rabbinic level. The only significant difference between Israel and Chutz La'aretz in this regard is that in Israel, essentially, the source for the mitzvah of challah is from the Torah, whereas outside of Israel, it's from the rabbis. So there is still some strength, you could say, to the land of Israel, because the source of the land of Israel is the Torah, whereas in Chutz La'aretz, it's midrabanan. And let's say in Israel, that could lead to more stringency, and in Chutz La'aretz, that could lead to some leniency. So that's the first step. We lack a majority of Jewish people in the land of Israel, which leads to the level of the obligation for challah to only be on a dirabanan level. Okay, then the second step is that the rabbis, towards the end of the Second Temple period, they made the decree that I spoke about before, that lands outside of the region which was conquered by the people who came in the Second Temple period, that all those areas were tameh. Okay, so that led to the requirement to separate 2 chalot, because we said there's no way that the first challah can be given to the Kohen because it's automatically tameh. Everybody's tameh mates. So no Kohen who's tahor can eat the challah. So the fact that there was an imposition of a decree that all lands outside of Israel were tameh mates, that required you to separate 2 chalot in chutz laaretz. So now there's a rabbinic obligation to separate 2 chalot in chutz laaretz. Then the nail in the coffin, the third step, is that in Eretz Yisrael, they ceased to practice the laws of purity. So now, even in Eretz Yisrael, there wasn't a pure Kohen who could eat from a pure challah. Right? There's no pure challah anymore. That essentially led to a machlokas, a 3-way machlokas in the Rishonim. Right? So it used to be, right, in that Mishnah that we read, that in Eretz Yisrael you separated 1 challah, and then in Chutz Laaretz you separated 2 challahs. But now that there wasn't any purity in Eretz Yisrael, according to the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher, now we start to separate 2 challahs in Eretz Yisrael, just as we did in Chutz Laaretz, because everything is tameh. According to the Rambam, everything stays the same. In Israel, you separate 1, and in Chutz Laaretz, you separate 2. Everything stays the same. But there's a third opinion. That's the opinion of the Rashba, the Smag, Tosfot, that even in Chutz Laaretz, you would only separate 1. Why is that? I think we said before that eating challah in Chutz Laaretz, it's all about kind of mimicking the practice that we had in Israel. So if the practice in Israel is only to eat 1, or it's only to have things that are, the fact that in Israel nowadays, Kohanim can't even eat the challah, in Chutz Laaretz we'll say, yes, nobody can eat the challah, so let's just separate 1. It used to be in Chutz Laaretz you could give challah to a Kohen, but now the fact that in Israel nobody eats challah will mean, yeah, in Chutz Laaretz you also shouldn't eat challah. Is that clear? Does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, I don't understand. What do you mean nobody eats challah in Israel? I mean, that's where it originated. It's a Torah obligation to give challah in Israel. How can you say? I mean, what are they saying?
So good question, Brett. So when you would give the challah to somebody, you would need to give the challah to a Kohen who was pure, and to give him challah which was pure.
Okay.
But once we ceased to practice, laws of purity and impurity in Eretz Yisrael, you couldn't give a pure challah to anybody.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
So then nobody would be eating challah in Israel.
Right. Okay.
So if the law of challah in Chutz Laaretz is just meant to mimic the practice in Eretz Yisrael, so when they would eat challah in Eretz Yisrael, then we would separate 2 chalot in Chutz Laaretz, so we can give 1 to the Kohen.
Okay.
When there's nobody eating challah in Eretz Yisrael, what's the reason to separate 2 chalot in Chutz Laaretz? Right? We should just mimic the practice in Eretz Yisrael when nobody's eating. And Chutz Laaretz, nobody's going to, we'll just separate 1 challah and we'll burn it. Okay, so that leads to the final halacha that the Ramah brings, that the minhag is to separate, right, a challah, which is, I wrote here on the screen, kol shehu, but the Ramah says the practice is a kezayit. So you take a kezayit and you burn it. Okay, so now we've categorized challah, and we've said perhaps it's truma, perhaps it's not truma, perhaps it's a mitzvah tluya ba'aretz, perhaps it's not mitzvah tluya ba'aretz, and we've spoke about the scope of the mitzvah and how we got to where we are, that in Chutz Laaretz everybody separates 1 challah and burns it. So now we'll get into other issues of Chutz Laaretz and challah.
Out of curiosity, does anybody follow the Rambam today?
Good question. Okay, so somebody just asked, does anybody follow the Rambam today? And we said, according to the Rambam, everybody needs to separate 2. Right? And you would separate the first challah and burn it. Right? You would take a symbolic amount and burn it, and then you would separate another challah, and you could even give it to Kohanim who are tameh. So then, why don't we follow the Rambam? Why can't it be that if I want to?
Why, but I'm just asking, does anybody
All right, so what if I wanted to?
Yeah.
Right, what if I wanted to separate two challahs? I want to be, everybody minhag, they separate one. I want to be extra good. I'm going to separate two. I want to feed my friend. I have a friend down the block. I think it'll be fun. I'll give him the challah. They'll be happy. Great. Okay, so there are 4 different reasons why we have a practice not to give challah to the kohen. Even though, right, we said according to the Rambam, you really should, or there's no change. Okay, so I'm going to be reading from the Shach here on the screen. Okay, so the Shach is the Siftei Kohen. He's one of the most important Acharonim commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch. And he wrote his commentary, I think, very young, when he was 30. And then he also passed away young, but was important Acharonim on the Shulchan Aruch. So he brings 4 different reasons why we can't give to the Kohanim. V'hayesh omrim b'Haggah. So the opinion in the Haggah, which says that nowadays in Chutz La'aretz we should only give 1 piece of challah, Sfir Alei, he holds, Zibekol inyan ein mafrishin ha'ivna rak challah achat. Right? No matter what, we only separate 1 challah nowadays. Afilu ein sham kohen tahor rak misha tuma yotzei mimenu migufo. Even if we have no other option, and we can only give to somebody who has a certain level of tuma, which would be fine, which would be allowed according to the technical halacha. V'hatam katvu haposkim. It's one of the reasons why they said not to give to the kohen. Lefisha tzarich l'shomra mizarim u'miavdei kochavim. So challah, like if we're going back, challah as a type of truma is prohibited to be eaten by zarim. Zarim are non-kohanim. Okay, it is prohibited for Israel. It is prohibited for me personally, Ephraim, to eat challah. So if I would start to just separate challah and give to kohanim, I run the risk of maybe eating it myself, which would be violate a severe prohibition. A second reason he brings, v'gam pa'amim shenotnin otam b'kara b'marak roteach. Right, sometimes you'll put the challah into a boiling pot of soup, and now it would be prohibited because now you have the taste of the challah into, your pot, and it would be prohibited. Okay. I'm going to skip to the 3 on the page. So the Maharshal brings the 3rd reason. Mishum delam machzikina bizman hazeh bekohen vadai. He says the identification of kohanim nowadays, right? It's uncertain. There are no kohanim, right? We all know, a kohen, but is he a real kohen? Right? Is he somebody that I can give, my truma to? Is he somebody I can give my challah to? So since there's nobody who can definitively prove their lineage, so according to the Maharshal, I can't really give challah to him because perhaps I'd be giving challah to a zar. I'd be giving it to a non-kohen. So that's the Maharshal's reason. And then the Maharil gives a 4th reason, and he says, "D'darkoli drosh barabim shelo lahachil lekohen katan." The Maharil went on a campaign. He went on like a public education campaign to tell people not to give the challah to a kohen katan, because sometimes you could separate, according to the Gemara, in theory, you could separate out 1 piece of challah and give it to a kohen who still hasn't become impure in his lifetime. Okay, so he says you can't do that. You can't utilize that option. And then the 4th reason is shelo yamru chalat chutz la'aretz ne'chelet, so that they shouldn't say that challah in chutz la'aretz is eaten. Right, this returns us to this sort of relationship between Eretz Yisrael and chutz la'aretz. Right, what's mimicking what? Right, we want chutz la'aretz to be mimicking the land of Israel. So in the land of Israel nowadays, nobody's eating challah because we don't practice laws of purity and impurity. But now in Chutz La'aretz, we had a pre-existing clause which allowed impure kohanim to eat challah. But if we were to give kohanim challah, we would basically have a situation where kohanim in Chutz La'aretz were eating challah, but the people in Eretz Yisrael weren't eating challah. So we don't want people to think that the challah which you're separating is going to the kohanim. So then that would lead to people in Israel maybe eating. So we have, say 4 different reasons. I guess I would break them up into 3. Right? The first 2 seem to be concerned about potential mistakes, kashrus mistakes. Then the 3rd reason was about the lineage of the kohanim, and the 4th one was that so people shouldn't say that in Chutz La'aretz they're eating the challah.
So for the first two, like, if you think that why we don't do it today, right?
Yeah.
Okay, because my first thought is what? So people weren't careful back when they were actually doing it. I mean, because it just sounded like I could see someone mistaking what he's saying by saying, oh, even back then when they did do it, nobody did it because nobody could be trusted.
Yeah. Okay. So what Jacob, for those who didn't hear, so Jacob said that he didn't like the first and second answer because it sort of implies that the people, in prior generations who did give to the Kohen, implies that perhaps they weren't careful. I think that's a good point. Okay. So now everybody agrees that you should burn. Right nowadays, the practice is you separate a symbolic amount of challah and you burn it. Okay. So how do you dispose of this challah? So the Mishnah in Tamura, at the very end of Tamura, says, "Be'eluhein hanisrafin." These are the things that must be burned. Chametz bePesach, right? Chametz before Pesach. Yisaref, you should burn it. Utruma tmeya, and truma, which is tameh, should be burned. V'harolav v'kilai hakerem. So let's do other prohibitions. Let's focus on truma tmeya. Okay, so now let's go back to the aspect of challah, which is truma, because I'm going to be applying this rule of truma tmeya to challah. Okay, so what's the nature of this idea that something needs to be burned? The Mishnah says that truma tmeya, impure truma, which would be the status of all challah nowadays, that all challah nowadays is tameh. So what does it mean that you need to burn it? This is actually a disagreement between Rashi and Tosfot. According to Rashi, the whole reason why I need to burn these things is so that people won't come to make mistakes, right? That people don't come to eat it themselves. According to Tosfot, there's an obligation to actually burn it. What would that mean for us? It would mean that according to Tosfot, when you separate that symbolic amount of challah, you need to literally burn it to a crisp before you can eventually throw that out. According to Rashi, the whole point is you shouldn't make a mistake. So you don't necessarily have to burn the challah in order to avoid making mistakes. You can take the challah, put it into a plastic bag, so to give it some respect, and then you can put it into the garbage. When I put it into the garbage man will take it away, and I for sure will not come to eat that challah. Okay, and the Rama relates to this, and he says, "V'yesh omrim kisher sorfin hachala osin lahesek b'fnei atzma." So when you burn it, the Rama says that some people burn it on its own. That you should burn it on its own. D'Yisrael asur lehanot mimena, because a Jew, non-Kohen, is prohibited from deriving benefit from challah, from truma. So when you're burning the challah, you can't, warm yourself by the fire. You can't warm yourself by the fire while you're burning your challah. And he says that the practice was to burn the challah inside the oven before they baked their bread. So how do we do this nowadays with our, electric ovens and such? We don't have bonfires to throw challah into and to burn it to a crisp. So the Pnei Halacha, Rabbi Elazar Melamed of contemporary Israel, so he gives a few pointers. He says, make sure when you're burning the challah, don't burn it on a kitchen pan that you have, because then the taste of the challah will go into the pan. That was the concern that we mentioned previously, and that would make your pan, you would have to kosher the pan. So he says, burn the challah at the bottom of the oven. Okay, well, if you don't want to do that, maybe it'll make a big mess. So he says, if it's wrapped, you can wrap it. It might take a longer time, but you can wrap it up. And then he says, even when it's burning and it's wrapped up, you can cook other things in the oven at the same time. Okay, but what about Tosfot's opinion? Tosfot said, let's say some people throw out their challah, right? I think, it took a poll of people. Most people don't burn their challah. Most people put it in a bag and throw it out. So we can rely on the opinion of Rashi, who says that the whole reason is that you shouldn't make a mistake. Therefore, you can dispose of it in the garbage. Because remember, challah in Chutz La'aretz is mid'Rabbanan. The essence of the obligation for challah in Chutz La'aretz is mid'Rabbanan. Therefore, you can rely on Rashi and throw it into the garbage. I just want to see how much time we have. Is Mrs. Wendy here?
I'm here, yeah.
Should I finish now? I can finish now.
Okay, great. So one moment. So okay, 1 second. Okay. I'll bring my screen back. Ephraim, and stop sharing so we can see everyone. Ephraim, can you stop the screen share?
Yeah, can I just summarize? I'll just summarize.
You can summarize. Summarize it. Before Ephraim summarizes, you can hear the background here of my children. So I'll go to my children to go with them. First, I want to thank again very much Ephraim for doing this class about the difference between Israel and Chutz La'aretz. Quite a complicated issue. We have 2 more classes next Wednesday by Matanya. He'll be doing it from Israel, zooming from Israel. He's now in Israel, and then in 2 weeks me. Afterwards, right after Ephraim finishes summarizing, so my wife, in the end of each class, so someone shares tips on baking, on braiding. So my wife will show 2 simple ways of braiding nice chalot. That take about 2 or 3, 5 minutes. And we thank you very, very much. So I'm running to look after my kids, and I'm leaving Ephraim to finish and summarize.
Okay, so I'm just going to summarize the points that we went over in this shiur. So we focused on 3 different issues. We wanted to categorize the nature of challah. So we said that you can understand challah just as another type of truma and as just another type of mitzvah tzuya ba'aretz, which seems to be the opinion of Rashi and Tosfot. Or you can understand challah as an independent mitzvah, it's distinct from truma, that it's a gift to the kohen, and it's a mitzvah that's not really dependent on the land, right? It's the obligation only sets in when you start mixing the dough, so it's not really dependent on the land. Then we spoke about the mitzvah, the scope of the mitzvah of Eretz Yisrael and Chutz La'aretz, and we said that there were 3 different lands when it comes to challah. There's Israel, an intermediate region, and according to the Rambam, all of the lands else in the world. Okay, and then we spoke about the evolution of the halacha. How do we get to the point that we're only just burning 1 challah? So we explained that once we stopped practicing purity in Eretz Yisrael, we started mimicking that practice in Chutz La'aretz, that we only separate 1 challah and burn it. And we explained that even if you wanted to, you can't separate 2 chalot in Chutz La'aretz and give it to the kohen, because there were different issues, kashrut issues, identification of kohanim issues. And then finally, how do you burn the challah? Can you throw it out in the garbage? And we said, right, you can rely on Rashi's opinion that the point of burning the truma is just to make sure you don't eat it, so you can throw it out in the garbage, which will ensure that you don't eat it. So thank you very much, and we can get to the meeting.
Okay, Ephraim, do you want to stop sharing your screen?
Yeah.
I said, do you want to highlight? 'Cause I can't see what they can see.
Here we go.
Okay, but you can't see me speak. That's exactly what